sounds like a stupid question.
Probably is, because, yeah, go ahead. Skilled managers equals high morale, which equals all that cool stuff that you cannot pay for and you can't punish for.
When you close off that feedback channel, you are not going to be able to hear the truth.
In the first microseconds, your brain can't tell the difference between physical danger and what we call social danger.
I'm pissed off at you.
Me, specifically?
Well, just because you're my boss and all.
Employees tend to get promoted until they reach their level of incompetence. Go forward and don't suck.
Folks, welcome. Managing with Mind and Heart podcast here. I am one of your hosts, Ethan Nash, and with me today, my co-host. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi,
again?
I am Michael Nash, the partner and father and friend of Ethan Nash.
That is right. Thanks for tuning in to another episode. We're excited to be here today. We've had this series of episodes on building a healthy leadership team, and it has taken us a while to get to the end of it. We've had episodes in between, but hopefully you've been following along. Today's episode, we are going to pick up on where Mike and our colleague Andrew left off in this series. They talked about conflict, and we're going to dive a little bit further into that and then talk also about building commitment amongst your leadership team. But before we get there, let's just give a quick review of the model that we're going through, right? And so this model was put together by the Table Group. That's Patrick Lencioni's consulting company. And this model really is, well, Mike, actually, let's have you talk through that for the audience. Give a review of what this model looks like.
Yeah, thanks. This model is about these levels of achievement or growth that a leadership team needs to work through in order to be successful. And although they are presented a little bit, consecutively, they're actually things that you're working on all the time, simultaneously. But it starts with the base, and our listeners, you can picture this pyramid with 5 levels. The base is called building trust, and we have an episode on that. The point on that piece is it's not just trust in the broad sense. It's really honing in on the concept of psychological safety. And it's important that we recognize the difference there. Coincidentally, just yesterday, I was working with the team, and we had this interesting conversation. There was 2 women in this team. One woman said to the other, I actually don't trust you in terms of when you say you're going to do something at a certain time or, deliver something at a certain date. I don't really trust that's going to happen because of our history. But I actually feel really safe telling you that, right? And giving you feedback about that. And we've had some discussions about it. And we determined in that conversation that they actually have psychological safety, which is what we're talking about. They may not trust each other in every aspect, right? Because the word trust is being asked to take on too much. It covers too much ground, right? But they have psychological safety. And for a team to have psychological safety, that is going to enable them to move up the pyramid in our model, right? Because the next level up is about conflict, which we'll be talking a little bit more about today, which is the idea that you can have authentic conversations. You can disagree. You can debate, you can have different opinions about a decision and actually come to the table honestly and openly and feel safe doing that. If you don't have psychological safety, of course, you can't do that. Mm-hmm. Now, if you can't do that, you can't get up to the next level, which is commitment, right? How do you commit to something if you didn't even have your skin in the game? You didn't even share your thoughts. You don't feel heard. You didn't participate because you were too afraid to. You didn't disagree, So you can't actually really truly commit, right? And so without psychological safety and the ability to disagree, you get false commitment, right? You get people nodding and smiling, right? So you get to commitment. You learn how to commit, which we'll be talking about today. And if that's done well, if there's actual commitment, you can move up to the 4th level of the pyramid, which is about accountability. Right? I can't hold you accountable if we didn't commit to anything, right? If I don't feel committed, if you don't feel committed, there's not going to be mutual accountability. And then without that, of course, you can't reach the top level, which is called results, which we'll talk about in a future podcast.
That's right. Great summary. Yeah. So again, there's trust, which feeds into conflict, which feeds into making commitments, which feeds into holding each other accountable. And all of that is to achieve your results, however you choose to define that as an organization. And like you said, I think the model's presented by Lencioni as, almost progressive in nature. But really, I think a lot of these things can happen together at the same time, right? For instance, I don't necessarily think you have to develop the ideal perfect level of psychological safety and trust to then start being able to manage conflict and debate in a healthy manner, right? In fact, I think something that you and Andrew talked about in the previous episode is that trust gets built through the process of going through conflict. The ability to have conflict gets built through the efforts towards achieving psychological safety and trust. So they can cycle back in a sense. Is that your understanding of the model as well?
Absolutely. In fact, it's all the levels cycle like that. Like you get all the way up to example accountability, right? You practice holding each other accountable. You practice giving feedback. You practice receiving feedback. You push the boundaries maybe on your sense of psychological safety, and you find out that it worked and it went well, right? Which builds more psychological safety. All of these cycles all these levels basically cycle, and they're sort of feedback loops with each other. Totally agree with that.
What are we talking about here when we're talking about a healthy team? With this model in mind, are we talking specifically just about executive teams, or does this model, do you think, apply to, any sort of leadership group or leadership team, right? Departmental leaders?
Yeah, I think to some degree it could apply to any group actually, but you have to do a little bit of kind of squinting and looking sideways to make it fit to a general big group of people. Where it really applies is any group of people who work together to make decisions, right? Any group of leaders, it could even apply to a group of department heads who all work together on a consistent basis to make decisions and to move forward together. So yeah, executive teams, leadership teams, any group of people that has real work to do together at the table.
That makes sense. And, listeners, to just keep in mind that, through this model, right, what we're looking to develop here are healthy leadership teams. And again, when we say a healthy leadership team, we're talking about one that, ultimately, collaborates well together, trusts each other to show up vulnerable, trust each other enough to take risks and hold each other accountable, right? And the health of the team, as Lencioni puts it, is really the multiplier of maybe all the intelligence you have on the team.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, you could have a group of really smart, talented people who do not have a healthy team, and you are not going to achieve the kind of results that you could achieve if you have a healthy team. It's the same idea of a healthy organization versus a not healthy organization.
Or a healthy family versus not a healthy family.
Yep.
So we're talking about health. And again, we're going to jump into some more on conflict right now. Mike, would you mind giving kind of a brief, very, very brief summary of the conversation that you had with Andrew on the episode about conflict a few episodes ago?
I will. And I love the way you stressed very, very, very brief. I got the subtext
very
there.
brief.
I got the subtext there. Yeah. In a nutshell, there are generally, we talk about 5 different styles, conflict styles. And this just means we have some tendencies toward certain kinds of showing up a certain way when we are in disagreement with other people. We have these tendencies. I think Andrew did a beautiful job of walking us through that. What we do with groups, and Andrew described this really well, we often ask people to pair up or get in small groups and discuss what messages did they learn about conflict growing up, right? What was the messages they perceived, the way they experienced it? What was their part in it? How did they grow up feeling about conflict? I just had this conversation with a group yesterday, and we actually chose to do this conversation together. It was a group of 5 people. We stayed together in one group, and people shared a little bit about their, the stories that they learned about conflict. And it was super, I just say there was a lot of vulnerability, and it really helped people get a sense of why everyone is showing up the way they're showing up. It gave people a lot of grace and empathy toward each other. And what that leads to is helping us identify how we tend to do conflict. And the bottom line is there was kind of an XY axis, right? One of the continuums we talk about is how in life, how firm have you held on to your goals versus how flexible have you been with your goals? And you kind of plot yourself along that continuum, and that's the X-axis. The Y-axis has to do with how firm we hold on to relationships versus how flexible we are in maybe moving on to other relationships. And it's really key that there's not a good or bad side of either of these spectrums, right? There's a time to let go of relationships and there is a time to not let go of relationships, right? And you kind of plot yourself along those different continuums, which helps you arrive at your conflict style. Just really briefly, somebody who's going to be more likely to hold on to goals tightly and relationships tightly is probably more likely to be what we would call a collaborator, and they kind of have a win-win style. Somebody who's a little bit more likely to hold on to their goals tightly and maybe relationships less tight, kind of a little bit more loose with relationships, might lean toward being more of the competitor. We call that the win-lose style. The person who tends to hold on to relationships pretty tight and their goals maybe not so tight, kind of a little more loose with goals, they're going to be the accommodator, where they kind of give in, and let the other person get what they want. The person who tends to hold on to both of them kind of loosely, their own goals and their relationships, we call that person the avoider, right? They're more likely to have the lose-leave style. And then the fifth style is kind of right in the middle. It's the person who's most likely to be the compromiser. And they kind of, we all get a little, we all give up a little sort of thing. So that's the basic idea. We talked about these different styles. I think Andrew did a beautiful job of reiterating that it's not the topic of conflict that's really the issue or the problem. It's how we do conflict. Conflict is inevitable. It's part of the human condition. We grow toward learning how to do conflict in a way that's going to really meet the needs of everybody in the group and help us achieve our goals. And I just want to say one more thing about that, Ethan. You said very, very, very brief, and I've already crossed your line on that, I'm sure. One other way that we help groups kind of figure out or individuals figure out where they land in that is you talk about how people tend to show up in meetings. And it's the same continuum that Andrew talked about. And it's one more layer that we tend to add on when we're talking with groups. The idea being when you're sitting in a meeting and you're watching the group and you're disagreeing, some people are going to show up as more committed to getting what they want. Some people are going to show up as less committed to getting what they want, right? That's the X-axis. Some people are going to show up more committed to making sure people's needs are met in that conversation. Some people are going to show up as less committed to that. That's going to be lower on the Y, or lower or higher on the Y-axis. So that's another way, combined with kind of the first discussion about our life goals and our relationships, to help us get to that conflict style.
Right. And, I think as you mentioned on that episode, our group at Nash Consulting, we actually got to go through this exercise of putting ourselves on that X and Y axis to kind of figure out where we land as a group in our styles. And, that was really, really helpful to see. And, one thing that came out of that exercise that really stood out to me here was just that the point is not that, if somebody has a win-lose conflict style, that doesn't mean that they always are using that style within conflict, right? They actually may access all the different styles in different situations and scenarios, right? But the point being, kind of as Andrew put it, when you're at your rawest, this is going to be the style that you tend to lean into. Again, it's not one of those things like we're putting people in boxes. This is how you always are, but it's important to recognize, okay, when tensions are high and people are at their rawest, how does this group tend to respond to conflict? That said, from that exercise that we did as a group, what was your conflict style?
Yeah, it was a little tricky for me, but I determined that I have spent a lot of my life in the kind of the win-lose category, but that in the last decade, I think I've ended up in the accommodator a little bit more than win-lose. So a little bit more likely to try to maintain the relationship harder, more committed to that in that conversation, and then be willing to kind of give up what I want to a fault, I've decided. How about you?
Yeah. when that's just interesting, kind of a demonstration that, your style can maybe change,
Right.
as you grow and develop and, have different life experiences.
Yep.
It was interesting because I was the one person in our group that fell squarely in the win lose category, right? I tended in life, I tend to hold on in my to goals, and those goals tend to be more stable compared to my relationships, whether it's a friendship or a colleague. I'm more likely to, if it doesn't seem to be benefiting, to, not hold on to those relationships as strongly.
Actually, one more quick thing that I thought Andrew did a really good job of explaining. Also, it's important to remember that all those different conflict styles are important and valuable in different situations, right? They're not, even though we're shooting for collaboration, right? That's kind of where we want to land in practice when we're working with a team. All those styles are important to be able to access in certain situations. There's a time to let go of your goal and give in, right? There's a time to withdraw. There's a time to push for what you want, right? They all are important skills to have. So I thought he did a really good job of reminding us of that.
Yeah, great point. From what I understand, you had an interesting experience the other week. You were working with an executive team on this exact model of becoming a healthy executive leadership team. You were talking about conflict with them and, learning to really engage in that in an artful way. And, something came up in that session with them about just the term conflict and how that might have been confusing for them or didn't quite resonate with them. Can you talk a little bit more about that and what happened in that situation?
Yeah. And it's actually a situation that has come up, I would say, almost every time I've worked with a team and we've got to this level called conflict. The word conflict is a trigger for many people. The word itself, I think, brings to mind, fighting and yelling and clawing, and it triggers people. And in much the same way that I don't tend to use the word trust very often when I'm talking about the first level, instead I call it psychological safety. I've been learning to think of conflict differently and not use that word. The long and the short of it is we arrive at the same term that we arrive at probably every time I do this work. And I let the group get there, right? But the word is, let's have authentic discussion. That's the term. Let's have authentic discussion, which includes when I disagree with you, I'm going to say something, right? When I feel that you're wrong, we're going to talk about that. When I feel like you've crossed my boundaries, I'm going to say something. When I need to give you feedback, right? That's really what we're talking about. And frankly, that's what Lencioni's talking about, right? When you read his work, when he uses the word conflict, he's just talking about authentic discussion.
Absolutely. Right. Authentic discussion around ideas, right? That's what we're talking about here.
Right.
And I do like that framing, the authentic discussion as opposed to conflict, because I've seen that as well. Conflict can be just a scary word and people just can't. And, this is going to be, cultural as well, right? I'm thinking of, the original group of Intel. I remember hearing, stories about them. They were very much a culture of debate and conflict. People that observed it said it was harsh at times, but that's how people did it, right? And there's other organizations that's just not going to be their culture. And so there's a cultural element here, and you got to figure out what works best for your group of how to frame this. But the point being, if we can show up in a way that we can really say what we're thinking about a topic or an idea, you're going to get to a lot better decisions when everybody has a chance to be heard. And as we'll talk about in a bit, more likely that you'll be able to land on some solid commitment around whatever you decide to do.
Yeah.
You mentioned a few minutes ago the idea that you want to have the collaboration style of conflict, right? When you are having these authentic discussions, you'll get to a better place if people can practice that collaboration style, right? And so what I guess the question for you is, why, first, why is it if we all have different conflict styles, right? Why is it that we need to get to the collaboration style to be most effective, if that is even so?
Yeah, I think that's really the hope, is that we recognize our actual conflict style. I forget the way you worded it, when we're not at our best, when we're maybe stressed out. What was the term you used from Lencioni? When we're at our rawest, I think you said, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the style that we might just kind of default into, right? And it's good to know that, so that we can then make the right adjustments according to where we're starting from, right? So if I'm an avoider, I can maybe force myself to kind of stay in, right? If I'm an accommodator, I can maybe hold on a little bit tighter to what I want, or, et cetera. The goal would be to practice the behaviors that fall under the category of collaboration. When we're together, having making a decision together, and disagreement comes up, or it's time to maybe move toward consensus, whatever it is. If we all have a sense of what collaboration looks like and what it doesn't look like, what are the kind of behaviors that would sort of sabotage the process, it's going to be much more likely for a group to be successful in having that conversation. And so when we're working with exec teams or leadership groups, we spend a fair amount of time digging into what it looks like to be a collaborator. And it's a muscle stretch. It's building muscles for some people. It's a change. It takes practice. It can be awkward.
And so then let's get practical on that. So then how do you do that, right? How do you get people to move towards the collaboration style? And maybe the better question is, what behaviors of the group would help the group move towards collaboration?
Let's kind of together talk about this, because I think you and I both have, we've had conversations very similar to this, even in these podcasts, right? I'm going to just start with I'm going to say probably the most important skill in the middle of disagreement, decision making in a meeting, et cetera. I would love to see everybody practice really good listening skills, like the kind of listening where you are willing to not jump in and interrupt, but instead maybe leave a little bit more space, a little bit more silence, let the person finish their thoughts, inquire. Hey, can you tell me more? Because our tendency, depending on your style, my tendency sometimes when I'm in my sort of win-lose mode is, you share something and I disagree, so I tell you what I think instead, as opposed to, right? Hey, can you tell me more about that? Demonstrate some curiosity and then really listen. To me, that's probably at least one of the most important skills you're going to practice if you're going to be a collaborator. What do you think about that?
I think that's spot on, right? Listening as a skill is a really good place to start. And, as a cousin of that, there's, watching your airtime, right? Being aware of, how much space am I taking up in this conversation, right? Is it someone else's turn to tell us what they think about this, right? So watching your airtime. And then I think you hit on another important skill there, which is just curiosity, right? Practicing the skill of curiosity will go a long, long ways, right? That is the mindset of, I am just going to be genuinely interested in what they have to say. And when you're interested, you start asking questions, right? You start asking for clarification, right? As opposed to, you're a closed door and now you're just advocating for yourself,
right? And
not really being curious about what they say. So that's another, I think, key adaptive skill to practice to get to collaboration.
Yeah, I love that. It's a mindset that leads to inquiry. Yeah, I love it. Circling back to airtime, it's funny because often when I talk about airtime, I almost always make the mistake of talking to the people who use too much airtime, and I forget to address the people who don't use enough. Mm-hmm. That's actually another part of airtime. I've worked with teams, and it's where you actually have to help the people who tend to accommodate and yield. You have to help them find their, to get on stage, right? To be heard. And you have to kind of talk to them about some tricks and a mindset that will help them be more willing to show up and speak up and, have their skin in the game. So that airtime thing is kind of a dance between sort of both halves of that, of that spectrum.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And we'll probably talk about this a little bit more, but the leader of this group plays a big role in facilitating that, right? We're not always aware when we're taking up more airtime, right? Speaking for myself. So the leader needs to be pretty skilled in being able to, kindly direct the conversation or pass the mic to somebody else. Hey, Jane, I would like to hear what you have to think about this now. Tom, we've heard what you had to think. So, let's hear what you have on that. So orchestrating that conversation so everybody gets an opportunity to weigh in so you can get to a point of, okay, now let's collaborate on, how we're going to move forward.
Yeah, that's the leader is probably the most important factor in how well this discussion goes. As we're talking through these different behaviors of collaboration, it also occurs to me that it's really important for the group to have this conversation that we're having right here. Like the group themselves should sit down when they're not having conflict, when they're not disagreeing, and talk about this. What does collaboration look like? What are those behaviors that we want to all aim for? What are the behaviors we want to avoid when we're having these kinds of discussions?
Right. And that's, that's almost kind of a meta type conversation, because you might even be gauging in the art of authentic conversation while talking about how to have conflict and authentic conversation and reach collaboration.
Right.
So when, again, those are some of the behaviors that might show up, and I'm sure we could keep going on that, but I wanted to hear a little bit more about your thoughts on, okay, we can talk about the behaviors. Now, how do we move to the actual point of collaboration? Like, what does it look like to collaborate on ideas?
Well, I think it looks like, again, let's kind of play with this together, but starting with, it looks like a lot of listening, a lot of asking, a lot of inquiry. I think it looks like acknowledging what people contribute. I see this sort of dynamic often where like somebody says something and it like a rock just drops and nobody says a word about it and they move on to the next thing. It's like, we acknowledge what was said. We ask for more. I think the term paraphrasing, people kind of look at this as sort of this corny, listening skill. I think it's really important in these conversations to have people willing to say, hey, I want to say what I think I heard. You believe that we should do it this way. Am I getting that right? Mm-hmm. Giving each other a chance to sort of correct and to be more clear. So it looks like really aiming for clarity as opposed to trying to win, right? But before you get to trying to get to the decision or the outcome, right, we've got to make sure that we understand. We got to make sure that that people feel heard. We have to make sure that all the ideas and thoughts are on the table. We keep practicing psychological safety in this moment by creating sort of the container for people to be able to speak up and disagree. It looks like not shutting people down, not insulting each other, not saying, well, that's stupid, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of this is some of the basic, I think, adaptive skills that you and I have talked about a lot on this podcast.
And again, in that situation that you're painting, recognize how important it would be to understand the different conflict styles of that group, right? When you start seeing someone really holding their ground and pulling in a direction, to be able to recognize that and accept that person for, who they are. And also for that person to recognize, oh, okay, I see how I am holding my ground on something when I probably need to be a little bit more open to alternatives. So just the awareness of the group is going to be key in just navigating those conversations.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think other behaviors that help us with collaboration would be the team being willing to do some organizational work during the conversation, like writing down thoughts on the whiteboard as people share things, stopping and looking at people's contribution and analyzing it a little bit. What do we all think of this? Who disagrees, who agrees? How would you reframe that? There's some really cool things you can do to just help the group move toward a decision together. So you can kind of picture this group who is self-aware of their own style, right? Their own default style, and committed to these kinds of behaviors. If they have that, I think they can talk about anything and have any disagreement, and it can still be a positive experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, just reiterating the psychological safety of this, right? This is going to be pretty difficult for people to show up authentically if there isn't at least some level of psychological safety, right? Because what does that produce? That produces the ability for people to take risks in what they say, right? To risk sounding quote unquote stupid, right? To risk asking a quote unquote dumb question, right? If people are not feeling safe, they're going to be protecting themselves and they're not going to be showing up authentically. All right. And so we kind of danced around this idea of landing at decisions, right? And ultimately, if you're having debate about something or authentic conversation about something, I'd imagine at some point you're gonna have to choose to, make a decision. And so, we have, a whole episode on the decision-making styles, but I wanted to get your thoughts on kind of how the concept of using decision-making styles comes into effect when people are working through conflict and differences in ideas on their way towards, collaborating on landing somewhere.
Yeah, it's actually really it's a important connection. It's almost profound. I've watched groups really figure this piece out, meaning this level about authentic disagreement, when they kind of combined it with the decision-making model. In fact, one group recently said it was a game changer for them to realize that, well, for example, if the leader says something like, hey, we're going to use style 5, and our listeners, I'm sure, don't remember what that means, but here's what it means. It's consensus, right? If
Right.
we're doing consensus right out of the gate, like we haven't really practiced these new muscles much, and we're going to jump in together and we're going to do a consensus on a decision that has some weight to it. It's kind of a big decision. It's a pretty, that's like maybe trying to bench press, way too much weight up front, because consensus is in and of itself is a challenging decision-making style. It's awesome. I mean, don't get me wrong. I love it when it works well, but if you don't really know how to collaborate, going into consensus mode can really be fraught. And so, something that's maybe a safer decision-making style to practice these new muscles with, or as you're working your muscles up, would be maybe a style 3, right? A style 3 means the leader is actually going to be the one that's going to make this decision. But before she makes this decision, she really, really wants to hear all the different thoughts and feelings and opinions from her leadership team. She really wants to know. In fact, that's going to be much of the data she's going to use as she makes her decision. Well, if you know that that's the style of decision we're using in this meeting right now, we're just all going to share our thoughts and ideas, and then she's
Right.
going to make a decision. It's so much safer, right? Because here's what'll happen. And in fact, I've seen this happen. It's a style 3 decision, and Jim is over there saying his thing, and Charlie just totally disagrees, and they start debating and disagreeing, and it starts out good, but pretty soon it starts to get kind of heated, and people get frustrated, and they forget, and the leader even forgets sometimes, that what, you guys don't have to come to agreement here. That's not what we're doing, right? We're all just talking right now about our ideas and our thoughts and our opinions, so that the leader can listen to all this and she can go and make a decision, right? So it's a really good sort of container, a style 3 decision or a style 2 decision, where the leader's sort of halfway there but still wants some input, right? For the leader to set up a situation where the group gets to spend 20 minutes or 30 minutes just talking and debating and having authentic discussion about this thing, and then he or she gets to go and make a decision, right? And so, and the other cool thing about style 3 decision, where the leader is going to make the decision, but they're going to ask people for input first. The cool thing about that is, in most cases, you don't actually have to arrive at the decision right then during the meeting, right? The leader doesn't have to say, okay, so therefore I've heard all these things, here's what we're going to do. They don't have to do that. They can often say, hey, thank you. Thank you for all this great input and all the discussion. This has been super helpful. I'll make a decision and circle back and let you know. So I think that labeling the decision-making style you're going to use is going to help the group know what their role is, which will then inform the way they're going to have a discussion.
Right. And that's a really important point, right? Because the whole idea with the decision-making styles, and by the way, we talk about the decision-making style model in episode 28. We'll link to that in the show notes. And we also talk about consensus, since we mentioned that in episode 35. Again, those will both be in the show notes. But, the point of, or one of the main points of decision-making styles is, people can usually live with whatever style that you choose, as long as you're clear about that on the upfront, which I can see why, consensus could be a little bit tricky in these type of situations, because, there's a few risks, and it can be done well, and there's a place for it. But, the risky part with consensus is you may go into this conversation where there's lots of debate and some conflict, and you've said we're going to do consensus, and it's just not getting there, right? And so you risk not being able to make decisions, quickly or in time, or you risk, having to pull the plug on consensus and say we can't do consensus anymore, which is a really big kind of no. You don't want to pull the plug. So I see what you're saying, that it can be safe to say, hey, you know what? This is an opportunity for the next hour to just air out our thoughts on this. And, ultimately I'm going to take this all into consideration. And then, I'll make a decision a little bit later. So right now it's just an open, safe space to have conflict. I agree with you. I think that's a safe way to go about it. In these conversations, can you speak a little bit more to, where the role of doing consensus would come into play, right? Is it still okay to do consensus, even though there's going to be a lot of differing opinions on, the route to take or where to go on that decision?
Yeah, in fact, I want to be really clear that I don't want to in any way downgrade consensus as a very powerful, valuable decision-making style. It's I think starting with style 3 when you're first learning how to talk things through is a great way to kind of, like I said, build up those muscles. But yeah, there's decisions that really need to be consensus. If you're working with an executive team or a leadership team and you really want them to have ownership, you really want them to have their skin in the game, you really want to try for consensus when you can. And I don't mean overdo it, because a lot of groups do too much consensus and it wastes too much time and you just don't have time for all that, right? But pick those strategic opportunities to get to consensus. Mm-hmm. And I believe that if a group is self-aware, again, about their styles, their conflict styles individually, if they've had these discussions about what collaboration looks like, and this is key, which I think we'll get to in a minute, if the leader has some facilitation skills to help the process along, I think a group can do consensus, and they should do consensus on many items.
Yeah, that's very true. I'm also under the belief that the more trust you have on that team, the more psychological safety, the easier it becomes to do consensus decision making, right? And especially, the trust that the leader of that group has on his or her team, right? If he or she really believes that I have a high quality group of people around me and, people that I trust, well, okay, maybe we should do consensus here, because I am not the person that knows exactly, knows it all, right? We really do need to make this decision together in a consensus building style. And so on the point of facilitation, right, how a leader facilitates the conversations and facilitates any decision making that you're going to do, that is a key skill, as we've said many times, right? The ability for that leader to create the environment to make it safe to have open discussion and debate is really important. How would a leader, what would be the behaviors that leaders would engage in to create that safe space for the authentic conversation?
Well, a little bit of a runway to that by saying, I just want to affirm what you just said. I think it's so important that managers, leaders take the time to learn facilitation skills. It's analogous to the Peter principle that we've talked about before, right? People tend to get promoted till they reach their level of incompetence, right? So, hey, you're a really good, accountant. Welcome to management. It's the same thing with this, right? You're welcome to management. Good luck. Welcome to leading a meeting, right? Good luck. I mean, this is a high level skill. There are like 20 moving parts all at the same time that you're trying to keep your eye on. And I just want to say to our listeners that if you have the opportunity to invest in learning how to be a facilitator, I think your organization should actually invest in training their people in how to facilitate, because the success of a meeting stands or falls on the skill of the facilitator, right? And meetings, as we've said a bunch of times before, are a microcosm of the broader culture. So I just want to emphasize what you just said, Ethan, that facilitation skills are really, really important. And in this case, there's conflict, there's disagreement. We want to have authentic conversation. We want to build psychological safety. So many things a leader needs to keep in mind, right? Let me just start with this. Be aware of your own conflict style. That's the thing I'm noticing now probably first as I'm working with clients, is the leader is going to, in some ways, broadcast their conflict style onto the group. So I guess I want to start with, being aware of your style as a leader, kind of where your default conflict style is, and recognizing that you yourself need to maybe move one way or the other and stretch some of your muscles, right? So that you can create a better container for the group to have that disagreement.
I think there's also a place, and again, this is going to be harder, I think, for people that have an avoidant style of conflict, but there's a skill of almost fishing for conflict, right? You're actually asking for people to speak up and engage in a dialogue based on what they think about things.
I love it. Yeah. I fishing for disagreement. Before I get to maybe calling on people, I would try to do a little bit more. There's an idea on the table here. Let's talk about the reasons not to do this. Like, fish for that. Let's talk about some pros and cons of this. So finding ways to make it safe, to make it expected, to make devil's advocate actually part of the process, right? We can get used to that together so it becomes part of our cadence.
Yeah. And I like what you said there, because you can actually fish for conflict by framing it as, let's almost have a philosophical conversation about this. Even if we, just for all intents and purposes, imagine we all agree with what this person said over here. What would be the reasons that this might not be a good idea? Let's brainstorm on that. Here's a question I really like. What would be the unintended consequence if we did this thing, right? And so getting people to really think about the other side of things, like almost take the opposite position of how they might feel, right? And I think you can also ask if somebody has a strong stance in one direction, to ask that person or those few people that have that stance, hey, what would be all the reasons why you might be wrong about that? Just think about that. What could all the, and so again, framing it almost as like, let's have a philosophical conversation here can really open up the opportunity for people to start thinking differently about it and get the feeling that it's okay to dissent here.
There's actually a bunch of other ways, we won't have time for today, but it's really about making disagreement, recognizing that it's important that we talk about our disagreements. There's basically a lot of different ways, a lot of different tricks and tools and techniques to get people to speak up and show up with their opinions. It really, what it's all about is creating not just a safe environment where people can speak up and about their disagreements, but it's expected. We're not going to actually arrive at the right decision if people aren't speaking up and disagreeing and sharing their actual thoughts and opinions, right? So let's not just make it boy, if you have to disagree, I guess it's okay. No, let's make it the norm. Let's make it part of the expectation that we're going to have these kind of conversations. And when I've seen that environment created, coupled with the other two factors, right? People know what collaboration looks like, and you have a leader who knows how to facilitate fantastic discussions. And you know what? Meetings are not boring when you see that happening.
Absolutely. We talked about a number of concepts there. Of course, one being fishing for it, and there's artful ways to go about it. The other piece there is just rewarding the behaviors that you want to see happen, right? As you've said before, it's dogs, dolphins, and humans, repeat behaviors they get rewarded for. And I've seen people miss this piece, even though they're happy and they're glad that the debate is going on. They're not stopping and saying, hey, what's going on right here? This is awesome, right? This is exactly the type of conversations we need to have. Or even when things start to get a little heated, to say, before I say anything, I have a comment on that. I just want to say that this is great, right? And you might even call out, I know we're getting a little bit heated there. I want you to know, that's okay. Remember, this is how we're going to get to better decisions, right? This is how we're going to really move the dial in the right direction when we collaborate like this. So you're finding opportunities to reward people for it. And I really don't think that can, although that might eventually seem annoying to people, right? I really don't think you can reward the behavior, too much.
Especially as a group is learning this skill. Yeah. I mean, at the very beginning, absolutely. And the way you said that was cool, right? Hey, everyone, this is awesome. What's happening here? Like I've seen that bring the tension down, and people are like, oh yeah, I guess this is good. And another way to do it is individually, right? Ethan just spoke up and completely disagreed with someone else or disagreed with me. Hey, Ethan, thank you, right? Thanks for feeling the courage or the safety or the trust to bring that up, right? That wasn't, that's not the most, not everybody agrees with what you just said, but we need to hear from you, right? So those kind of comments, I think, are fantastic.
Yeah. And I think what you were alluding to is, especially from the point of view of the leader of that group, right? When somebody pushes back against what the leader thinks, that is one of the most important time to reward them for that, to let them know that is okay, to say, like you said, I appreciate you pushing back against me. That's exactly what I want to see happen in this group. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
Right. And thank you as a reward. And so you can fish for it. You can reward the behavior. What else can you do here?
It's funny because we can spend a day and a half training on this, and we do. So I have so many things in my mind right now, but I just want to mention a couple others. The leader is going to be the one that creates the space for people to disagree, right? And that means things like saying, all right, hey, this concept we've thrown out there, we're going to have some discussion about this. Could everybody just take 2 minutes right now and not talk and just process? Right? Because as we've talked about here before and in our behavior styles episodes and other places, about half of the population are processors, right? They think to talk. And the other half of us are expedients. We talk to think. Well, guess who's going to use up all the airtime if you just let it go, right? These expedients are going to just talk, and they're going to process while they're talking. And your processors are going to not have their moment. And then, you leave a 4-second break or a 5-second break. It's not enough. Processors don't jump in, and expedients repeat themselves. And you just have these really off balance, discussions. And so, moments of silence more than one time in the meeting to get people a chance to catch up and process and maybe write their thoughts down, having people get into pairs or trios to talk about it first and then come back together. Now, when you do it that way, quick note on that, when you come back together, you say to them, look, I'm not expecting the three of you to come back and be on the same page. This was a chance to process. You come back and just share your thoughts and feelings. You don't have to come back and represent the group. It's a chance to process, right? And there's a lot of other techniques that the leader needs to practice to, again, create this space so that people have a chance and people have, a moment to be able to jump in and share what they want to share.
Yeah. And just to add to what you said, giving people time to process, putting them in the groups. I mean, another really, really simple one is put it out a day or two before, you're going to have this conversation. And you can even say there, I want to have an open and honest conversation about what everybody thinks about this and feels about this. So just putting down the agenda in advance to give people like me time to process.
Yep. So, that's great. Yep.
Yeah.
Another idea is the leader remembering their power differential. And that's another podcast that we've done. Your power differential in a meeting where there's discussion about people disagreeing about ideas, your power differential is really apparent. It's loud psychologically, no matter what, it's just there. And so it's probably one of the most important places to manage your power differential, which means you as the leader, I'm not going to be the first or second or even third person who speaks up each time. I'm going to hold back. I'm going to give people a chance. I'm going to ask some questions more than I'm going to make statements. I'm going to be really economical about how often I share my opinion, especially if we're doing consensus. I mean, oh my gosh, even more so. Like you really have to, in fact, here's a little trick on that. When I do consensus and I want to participate as the leader, I have to actually say to my group, I recognize the power differential here. And I know the tendency is, if I say, I think this, you're going to think, well, that's what Mike thinks. So therefore, that's probably what I should think, right? Well, no. In fact, I'm asking you right now to let me be a peer. And I know it's not real. I mean, we can't erase the power differential, but I want you to understand that when I participate, I am just making suggestions right now. I'm just sharing ideas, and I truly want this to be consensus. So don't let my idea sway you. But even with that, I have to hold back. I have to participate less.
Awesome. That's really, really good stuff. And as we'll see here in the next episode, when we talk about commitment, doing all these things that we just talked about is going to make it so you can make really, really solid and clear commitments, because people are usually, in most cases, okay with what decision you land on, even if they ultimately disagreed with that decision, when someone feels like their ideas were at least understood, they can, in most cases, still fully commit to that.
Yeah, they feel heard, but also they had their skin in the game.
Absolutely. Next episode, we'll talk about the whole concept of disagree and commit. So folks, tune in to hear us talk about commitment, and then we'll also cover accountability and, of course, conversation about results. Quick note here before we sign off. We, Nash Consulting, will have our signature 5-day leadership management workshop series available to the general public this April 2022. Come join us. It's 5 days, 5 weeks in a row, where we really dig into the art and science of showing up as a leader in a way that builds engagement, builds morale. It's going to be a fun time. We do this once or twice a year, so you can check out our website for more information on that, and we'll put that link in the show notes as well. So, besides that, Mike, anything else?
No, hey, everyone, thanks for being here with us.
See you next time.